computer. You can choose green back on this one. Cheers. Thanks, Jackson. All right, sweet. So today's main presentation is basically just to talk about footy boots. And I bet during that quiz, it was a little bit confusing to distinguish, okay, is this a men's or a women's football boot, which is part of the reason why I'm presenting on this topic today. So the main objective is mainly just to get an understanding of what the women's footy space looks like currently with regards to footy boots, etc., and what we can do basically as health practitioners for recommendations. And then towards the end, I'll go into more some podiatry specific things that we can offer as health practitioners. And then I want to allow a little bit of time at the end. So if there are any physios or people here that do work in the footy space and have something to say that might be related to their own football team or some insights that they have on their own, I'd really like them to contribute to this conversation too. So that's pretty much what we'll be doing today. So just to give you an insight as to what's been happening in August for myself. So I've been attending a couple of female specific sporting events. The first one I went to was at Bed Footwear earlier on in the month, and we heard from three great speakers. Brooke Patterson, she's doing the Prep to Play program at the moment, and two podiatrists, Emma Poynton and Madeline Murray. And then I also flew up to Sydney for a Women in Football conference, and we heard from a FIFA researcher named Kat Krieger. We also heard from Emma, Sam Turner and Thomas DeCanto, and they're all podiatrists working in either a football club or in a soccer team. So they had some really insightful information. So the first thing that I really wanted to go into is one of the Kat, who's the FIFA researcher. So part of her role in FIFA is to look at the sports engineering and biomechanics side of things when it comes to designing football boots and things like that. So she's put together a little bit of research herself to try and work out what's out there in the women's sporting field. Apparently there's only about 32 scientific articles on the technological requirements of female football athletes, and that includes your soccer, your footy, your rugby. She's mainly based in Europe, so doing a lot of the European football. There's really not a lot out there. And when I mean technological requirements, we're talking about boots, we're talking about pitch surfaces, we're talking about playing kits. So a lot of the research that's currently out there is all on men. So we actually don't know what the female foot needs when it comes to designing a football boot that's going to be accommodative, comfortable for playing football, which is sad. Like, we don't have an understanding of what stud configuration should be there, the stiffness of the shoe, instep height, midsole, support, etc. So with this in mind, with the little research that we've got, how do we know what female athletes require? So it comes to mind, like, what are the current female football boots out there based on? What are they basing their designs on? And why are they being advertised as female specific and specific to the female foot? So what do we know? So we know as healthcare practitioners that not all women have small and narrow feet. And you're probably thinking about your own feet at the moment, like, no, my feet are bigger, my feet are wider. And there's a common misconception in the research that all women have small feet. So they're basing a lot of that information on their current designs of women's football. Kat Krieger, who was doing the FIFA research, she's done her own little stuff in Spain, I believe it was. She went around to a couple of different footy clubs and noticed that there were huge differences in variations with culture in areas of pressure and painful points in football boots. So it does vary from different cultural backgrounds as well. And we also know from a podiatry perspective that women have a higher incidence of forefoot pathologies. So your bursitis, your synovitis, your neuromas, all of the things like bunions, where we know they've got more of a flexible forefoot compared to men. So to say that everyone has, a smaller, narrower foot just doesn't actually exemplify what is currently out there. We do know from a female football boot perspective that in the earlier seasons in footy, the girls were made to wear the men's boots, which are obviously a lot stiffer, a lot bigger, a lot wider, and not accommodating and simply too big, and giving a lot of the girls either MSK or dermatological conditions that could have been avoided if they were put in smaller, better fitting shoes for their smaller foot shape. And then we also know the first few AFLW athletes that were coming out all came from different sports. So they were all exposed to different shoes. So basketball shoes, hockey shoes, and then they were forced to go into men's footy boots, which are obviously a lot bigger, a lot different compared to other shoes. So we've got more increased ground force reactions, things like that, which they haven't been exposed to. So we have all these factors that can increase the risk of developing injuries. So yeah, we don't really have any evidence on women's sport in general, women's footy boot requirements. And we do know from our side of things as health practitioners that no two females or women have like small, dainty feet. We see a wide range of foot shapes and sizes, and depending on their cultural background as well. So what are the footwear brands actually currently basing their designs off? So if we have a look at this slide here, these are screenshots of one of the presentations that one of the podiatrists did. So if we have a look at the top left, we've got a common brand that's pretty well known, Addy Sport. Addy Sport was designed, I can't remember what country it was, but they are one of the first to come out and say this is specific for women, for female. You can see in their slogan at the top that women play sports, so we make football boots for women. So we actually fit women's feet. Interestingly enough, the design of this football boot was actually just a mold of the person that made it. Her name, I can't remember, Laura. She basically made a foot mold of her own foot and called that the women's specific design, and used that design to mold all of her shoes. So she's basically used her own foot mold, called it to fit all women, which clearly isn't for all women. If we look at the ASICs on the right-hand side, you're seeing it's made for me. It's made specific for women, when the only thing that they've done is made the shoe size smaller, and there actually isn't much of a difference between the men's versus the women's with regards to sport. If we have a look at the bottom left, we've got the Nike. So we've got researched women's-led football boot design saying that because on average females have a smaller foot, that they require more touch zones than a typical male-led design. So they've made this design in the forefoot to allow a little bit more traction. But that's not to say that men don't need that either. And there isn't any evidence to say that women need those extra touch zones. And the only thing that they're going by is women have smaller feet. And they've strategically done this right before the Women's World Cup. They've brought this football boot out. And then if you look next to that, you've got Puma. So in their slogan, they've got women's football has always been a priority for Puma. So what they did was they reduced the instep height and chucked a couple of flowers on the shoe design, and that was launched in 2021. So women have always been a priority for Puma, and they came out with that boot 2 years ago. So that's just to give you an idea that the football boot market is mainly for marketing, drawing women in, saying, okay, these are designed for women's feet, when really they're just smaller. They're the exact same as men's boots, just in a smaller fit. So yeah, that comes to this next slide. How is it different to men's? Truthfully, there really isn't much of a difference at all. You might have heard of this concept going pink it and shrink it. So this is a screenshot of my web browser designing this slide, this PowerPoint presentation as we speak. And you can see majority of the shoes are more what we'd call stereotypical for what females would like. So they've changed the color, they've made them smaller, but they're actually not specifically designed for a women's foot. It's just more to accommodate for those smaller shoe sizing. So it does help in the sense that women don't have to rely on men's boots as much, so they can access those smaller sizes, but we still have that gap in the market for where we have still small, narrow boots. And there are a lot of women out there that have really wide toe boxes, and there just aren't any shoe designs out there to accommodate for that. So overall, there's no difference in stud configuration, not much difference in traction, midsole support. They're literally identical, and it just comes down to size. We did have ASICS come in and give us a little bit of an insight as to how they design their footy boots. So ASICS have an 18-month footwear design cycle where they focus on changing one key element of the shoe. So it might be the stud length of the boot, it might be the outsole design, might be the weight of the shoe. And then every 12 months, they try and do 2 of these. So they try and do 2 cycles every 12 months, but it does take a full 18 months for it to get to the end point where they're taking it to retailers, seeing if they can gain interest. If there's no interest, cool, they won't release it, they'll move on to the next design. And if that's the case, then they've gone a full 18 months of a possible new design that could have been available to women's footballers that has just gone out the window. So we don't have a wide variety of women's boots because they do take a long time. And there's also no evidence for these football companies to be like, hey, this is what women need. So they have an idea of where to sort of hone in on and specify with their designs, which Kat sort of demonstrated at the consulters in the conferences to what needed to be done to help escalate things. So what can we recommend? These are just some 5 quick recommendations we can do as healthcare practitioners just to help with our patients with recommending shoes. So match the playing surface with the patient's requirements. So know what they're training on, know what they're playing on. If they have, if they're playing on more firmer grounds, they probably benefit from more of a shallower stud, just so that there's a little bit less traction and they've got a higher ability to sort of, push off surfaces quicker without getting stuck in grass, things like that. If they're playing on more of a soft ground, get them into a longer stud. So that way they actually have a little bit more traction. They're not going to go slipping and sliding around in muddier surfaces. Obviously, if they're playing on an artificial turf, you'd give them more of an artificial outsole as opposed to the other 2. Another thing would be is to match your stud choice or preference with the patient's pathology too. So if you know you want to minimize the amount of traction because they might have had a previous ACL injury, you might be more recommending the shorter stud configuration just so they have that less traction underneath and they're less likely to fall and bend and, if they're going to get tackled, change of direction, things like that. Another key element that I'd recommend is making sure the shoe can have a bit of a heel offset. So if their previous injury or pathology, they needed an extra bit of heel height, ASICS do have a special feature in their footy boots where they offer an extra 10mm heel pitch. It might even be beneficial for those that might have been doing pre-season in runners and doing lots of running, and then they're going to transition into a footy boot. They'll have that extra heel pitch, which their runners may have had to make it a smoother transition into the footy season. Another thing is size is very subjective. So look at your patient's foot, look at the player's foot. If they benefit from a wider, larger fit, recommend a men's shoe. And if they would require a smaller, narrower fit, recommend a women's. And then it can be vice versa. So if a male's got a smaller, narrower foot, they'd probably be better off in the women's because they're literally identical. There's not much differences between them except for the shoe size. And then obviously get your patient to try them on before they buy them. A lot of the injuries and things we see from a podiatry perspective come from shoes not fitting well. To prevent ingrowns, blisters, things like that, we want to make sure the shoe is fitting, they've got enough wiggle room, and there's about a thumbnail width between their longest toe and the end of the shoe. So making sure you know a good retailer that you can recommend that has a wide range of shoes would be the best thing. So they're my top tips and main takeaways from the conferences and stuff as to how we can recommend boots for female football athletes with the minimal amount of football boots on the market that we've currently got. So this is more towards the podiatry specific stuff. So what can we do as podiatrists to help treat conditions? So we had the podiatrist talk at the conference about this. So Just some internal boot recommendations. At the rear foot, we can obviously add heel raises, rear foot wedges. In the midfoot, we can add arch pads or padding to help give them a little bit more arch contour. In the forefoot, we could add metatarsal bars and domes, all sort of extrinsically. And then we can add carbon plates to help versus MTPJ stuff. I will go into that a little bit further on the next slide. But a good prefab device that they've recommended for stud irritation and sore toes was soft soles, because they're more thin, they're easier to pop in and out and less bulky compared to your form orthotics. So I don't have a picture of them on this slide, but from a podiatry perspective, if we'd be interested in getting them in, I'm sure we can sort that out at a later date. Just some external boot modifications. They did recommend you can shave off stud heights to minimize pressure underneath where the studs are. Most of the time, the studs will be placed close to bony prominences or joints, so to help reduce pressure, they've recommended that, but only small grinds, obviously, so we don't alter too much of the patient's mechanics. Just some internal foot stuff, gels, toe spreaders, felt cushions, blister cushions, things like that, just to help minimize blisters, irritation against the toes, etc. And then orthotics, I'll go on to the next slide. A key theme, though, for all of these football modifications was not to do too much immediately, given that if you're dealing with an elite level player, they're in their boots all the time for training and games. So small changes in load like this, like adding a heel lift, needs time, and you can't be fiddling around with too many things at once, because small changes like this are going to translate into higher training differences and loads when they are completing their training and games. So this is a little slide that talks a bit about orthotics. So first I'll talk about prefab devices. So there were the devices that I mentioned before, but there's also one called the Superfeet Carbon, which is more of a low profile prefabricated device and does have a little bit of the carbon plate in it too. So if you want that extra added benefit of having that as part of the shell, then that is another alternative that we could also recommend for patients. When it comes to carbon plates, they were saying to recommend avoiding using them just because they're very fiddly, and a lot of the footy boots will typically have a little bit of a toe spring, so a little bit more of a curve like this, and they can be quite difficult to fit in, and they take up a lot of room because of that toe spring region. So if you can, try and go for more of a stiffer, firmer boot. But if you need to use a carbon plate, you just got to make sure it matches that toe spring and doesn't cause any discomfort for the patient. They also did suggest adding a heel lift in there too, just to help minimizing overall loads underneath the bottom of the foot. When it comes to a prescription from a top cover perspective, full-length devices are probably preferred as opposed to shell and web length, because they do create a lot of friction points in the shoe itself. So to minimize blisters, shoe movement, to go for a full-length top cover. Some low friction types of top covers would include Spenco. It's probably the best one that we can use from Footwork, but ETPU and PEVA are the best because they do have the highest energy return. There might be a low amount of places that do supply them, but they have been the best for the AFL athletes in the past. When we're considering using Pour-On for a bit of shock absorption, it is very hydrophilic, so it likes water. So if we know the patient's going to be running in muddy, wet surfaces, to use something that's going to be a bit better suited. So whether there's a softer EVA that we could use underneath, that would be a little bit better than using Pour-On. They also said to avoid using vinyl for the same reasons. It's too slippery and can get a bit wet. If we are recovering devices for athletes, but even in general population, they recommend using like an aerosol spray as a glue as opposed to the brush, just because it sticks better and the glue doesn't soak into the materials as much as using the brush with the glue. So that's a better way to reduce air bubbles, things like that. So I just thought I'd throw that in there if we were to consider a difference in how we could do our top covers here. Considerations from a shell. We obviously need to be more on the conservative side. We don't want to take up too much room in the shoe. So being conscious of how thick we prescribe the devices. From modifications perspective, you'd probably pick your intrinsics over your extrinsics for the same reasons for shoe fitting. And then from a type of shell material, it's just whatever works best for the patient's pathology and room in the shoe. So your polys, your EVA, your nylon, your 3D, whatever is best suited for the patient. And then just general considerations, you got your 4-foot volume, width, depth of the shoe. You want to enable the patient has a nice wear-in process with their training volume so they don't develop any irritation. And also player fussiness. You don't want to be going around doing too much with their orthotics and too much with their shoes to the point where it affects their ability to participate in games and participate in training and things like that. So the less is best, essentially. But yes, so that's pretty much sums up my presentation. So I've got some references here, which I'm more than happy to share the presentation with everyone after if they did want to look into anything that I've spoken about today. But I think we've got some time now at the end. So let's all have a bit of a chat. If you guys have worked in footy, played in footy, know what's been out there with regards to like the problems that maybe female footballers have with football boots. I'd really want to hear it because from a podiatry perspective, like it's my goal to maybe work in a footy club one day and be that podiatrist to offer that advice. So if you guys think like, what have you guys seen? Is there a space for podiatry in footy? And let me know what you think about what I've had a chat about, what I've discussed, and we'll go from there. So take it away, whoever wants to go.
Can I ask a question, Addy?
Yeah.
Recommended usage time for a pair of boots. Obviously, like say like an elite level, like an AFLW or a VFLW female athlete is training. They've probably got 3 nights of training a week plus game. Like how long before they should be replacing their boots? How many Ks should they be doing in those?
Well, it comes down to a few different things, actually. You might have different ways the players actually access their boots. So if the players actually get funding to get new boots regularly,
They don't.
they have to pay out of pocket.
Yeah. The women don't. The women don't unless they've got a specific sponsorship deal.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it also comes down to player fussiness too. Do players like to refresh their boots regularly? Do they like to hold on to their boots for, 1 or 2 seasons because that's what they're comfortable in? But just from a podiatry perspective, if you notice that the shoes become a lot more flexible, a lot more worn, you're starting to notice at the back of the heel, they're developing maybe a little bit of a hole because their heel starts to rub there. If it's becoming extremely flexible and not offering that same level of support, yeah, definitely get a new one. But we generally recommend for runners around 500 kilometers before you start to see some wear and tear and compression in shoes. So from my understanding, it would probably be similar. Even with footy boots, there's less cushioning and things like that. So you probably want to be replacing them at the start of every season. Mm. But if you're more of an elite level player, it might be more than that.
Well, I know that some of the men's players, like they go through like 15 pairs of boots a season. So, but they're getting that's the rep was saying that some of their players, do purchase that many, even if they're not sponsored, they just go out and buy that many. But,
well, I've had athletes that have literally had the same pair of boots for 2 to 3 seasons. So my general recommendation was every season they should be getting a new pair, given how much they train. But yeah, just wanted to get your thoughts in terms of like if there was a specific K limit or anything, because these athletes, like some of the girl athletes that I've been working with in the last year, they're doing minimum probably 6 to 8 Ks a session, 3 sessions a week, then plus game they can do up to 8 to 9 Ks. Sometimes I've had some that even do up to 10. So they're already hitting, quite a lot. That would mean that they're probably only lasting about 10 to 12 weeks in a pair of boots. So convincing them to buy probably, for an 18-week season, you're probably looking at least 2 pairs of boots probably per season, do you think?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, okay.
You play in the summer or the winter or both?
Sorry?
You play in the summer, the winter or both?
They play in, well, Pre-seasons, well, if you're talking VFLW, pre-season starts in November, and they only finished a couple of weeks ago, so they're literally like 9 months, 8-9 months of work. So, and they're in boots from like the beginning.
You playing soft surface or soft ground, or is it all hard ground?
Can be anything, depends on where they go. So like their games, home and away games, like some grounds are harder than other ground. One ground's at Sandringham, so it's right next to the ocean, so it's completely different and a lot sandier than say like when we played at the Hangar, and that's like a beautifully curated turf. Like they're just different qualities depending on some play all over the shop. And I think AFLW is not too dissimilar. Like they play at Casey Field versus Victoria Park versus wherever.
Yeah, welcome to Melbourne, Alex.
Sorry, there are supposed to be like minimum standards as to where they play. Like the pitch is supposed to be a certain condition, but often it's not. It's often like super muddy. So like by the middle of winter, it's super muddy, super wet, like very fairly soft.
Find out if you've got players that rotate the same pair of boots for a couple of seasons. Find out why. Like, why do you have the same pair of boot? Is it because you like
usually
it?
cost?
Is it expensive?
It's usually cost. So a lot of these athletes aren't paid at all. In VFLW, they only get paid if they get on the field, and that's a very small match payment.
There's also there's different tiers of boots as well. Tiers and think of like gold, silver, bronze.
Yeah.
Are they wearing top tier, mid range, lower end range? Again,
they're all different. It's all very personal preference based, and a lot of it's not very scientific. It's like I like the colors.
Yeah.
Generally, that tends to be the thing. We've got obviously a lot of our female, like our higher level athletes tend to be very tall. Our ruck is 6'4", so she's can't fit into most conventional women's boots because they've usually got big long feet, big wide feet as well too. Like really quite wide that none of the women's boots fit them width wise. I don't fit into a traditional women's boot. Like the Asics Tigreals, the women's don't fit me at all. Even if I go 2 sizes up, they still don't fit because the width, like, yeah, they for some reason think we all have little foot binding lady feet. But yeah, like we're usually putting them in a men's boot, if anything.
You also have to be mindful that boots are also moving away from leather.
There's a few that really like the leather because the durability aspect if they're having to get through them for a couple of seasons.
Yeah, the leather options just becoming a little bit dwindled. But if cost is your issue, what really can we help with cost? You know?
Yeah, there's a lot of like cultural stuff around it too. Like a lot of the athletes I worked with last year were just like, I just like Asics. Asics are better boots. No real like science behind that, so to speak.
Very anecdotal.
Yeah, very like, oh, I just find Asics fit better, or like a lot of the athletes I was dealing with didn't like the Nikes because they feel too thin and too light, almost like they feel like they've got no support. They feel very bendy, particularly the models with the sock liner thing. They didn't like that, so they like something a bit more rigid and feels a bit more like covered and a bit more stable, like Tigreals, the Lethals, the Ultimate FF's got a bit of a run if they'd been to see a podiatrist, obviously.
Keep in mind with what Addy said before in regards to Asics, provide a 10mm heel pitch or a heel height in the boot. Often that can translate to the comfort of a running shoe. So it feels like a running shoe in the sense of...
Is that why the FFs are so popular? Because they've got like a higher heel height?
All of the Asics have it, so it might be that particular style, or maybe even that Asics has a nice color, like you were saying, and they might just go for that. Yeah, there's heaps of factors to consider. But a lot of the brands too, like your Adidas and Puma, if you go on their website, now all of a sudden they're advertising as unisex boots. But they are still for a men's last. So they're still going to be too wide. They're still going to be too big. So there still needs to be a lot more done in this space to accommodate, so women have more of a wider selection when it comes to getting a boot for footy. Shouldn't be this hard.
Is it fair to argue, Addy, that like a foot is a foot and there's no real difference between women's and men's feet? You just got to work on the individual and their foot to find the right fit. Like
Yeah, exactly
Like
right.
like you said, I've seen some women athletes who've got extremely wide, stiff, extremely wide, flexible, short, skinny, narrow. Like, is there really ever going to be a football boot that is designed for a woman's foot? Like, what does that mean? What's the difference between a women's and a men's foot? And I guess they're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I think what needs to come out is more research papers just on female, like when they're doing their sample sizes, getting more females in the research, so we can actually make those associations between, okay, can this help improve the risk and reduce the risk of certain pathologies? I don't think we're ever going to define a boot as a men's and a women's. I think we just need more range. Finding shoes, whether it be runners or football boots, it should be like buying a bra. You've got your number, you've got your letter. You find out what your letter is, you find out what your number is, and that's your size. It shouldn't come down to if you're a male or a female. I think that's the way shoe sizes should be going, but we just don't know enough about women in sport in general. So I do think that research is still warranted to find out if there's any differences and if we need to accommodate more, whether it be the stud configuration, things like that, that we are yet to know because the men and women's boots are the identical, to make it more comfy for female athletes to participate in footy, because they've been, in men's for so long that aren't probably designed for their foot shape.
Could I ask you a question? The interventions that you had there, they had one of them was like, you can put a like putting in a heel lift, for example. If you're what do you think are the changes that happen if you've got like a low drop footy boot and you put a heel lift in it? What are the disadvantages of that versus just going for a higher heel drop boot?
Oh, look, I don't think there's any disadvantages to it.
It's the same thing, because I'm like wondering if a gradual, like, are we affecting the mechanics of the midfoot if we're just going like high in the back and then it's just.
No, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with popping a heel lift in there. I think the other brands that aren't ASICs, that don't have that heel pitch, a lot of the designs that they're making now, they're making them a slightly wider to remove the liner. So you can actually go and make those modifications. Like we had Mizuno rep come in a couple of weeks ago, and they basically have a shoe that's designed for that. So if you need to pop shoes, orthotics, heel lifts in there, you have that ability to do that. So if you do have players in your footy team and you're considering putting a heel lift in there or going for an ASIC shoe, I don't think it's going to matter either or what you decide to do.
Yeah, because we have like the classic issue is players have a preference of brand, or maybe they have a partnership.
Yeah.
So yeah, changing the brand might be like off the table for whatever reason. So it's just like, yeah, that's good to know. The other thing, like just to comment on whether podiatrists are required in footy clubs, absolutely. Our podiatrist Gus at the club, he's in once a week, and it's huge. Like, yeah, we rely on him a lot for like basic care stuff, derm stuff, and things like that kind of thing. But also like all the boot mods, and we had a bit of an uptick in plantar fascia stuff after a series of games in a row at Marvel, for example, which is considered a firmer ground.
Mm-hmm.
And we also heard a story from one of the GWS people where they had a series of games where they were in Perth and then at Marvel, and then they had this uptick in plantar fascia and calf injuries, and they're wondering like, things like that. So yeah, it's really interesting because, I'm not sure if you would change the boot type because you're playing at those grounds, because again, like you said, you can't make big changes. But it's probably just things to keep in mind more so.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
I agree with Yana. I think there's definitely a role for like adjustable modifications for things like if they're going to be playing a few games away on a harder surface, you may do some padding in the shoe or give like lift or heel lifts for like depending on they're going through a period of, Achilles pain or something like that, like more customized, like particularly in a footy club's environment where there may be funding for that sort of thing, to have a more integrated role of podiatrist in terms of like being able to go through all the athletes' boots and be like, okay, we can customize a lot of these boots to a lot of your lower limb and profile of that sort of stuff, giving, somebody a bit more arch support before they develop, a first race stressy or something. Like being able to actually do that on a more like involved and proactive level, that would be awesome someday. I don't know if it's ever going to get to that stage, but that would be really cool, because a lot of the time when we've had to use it in our space, when we've used Gust in our space, has been after something's happened.
Yeah. Would be cool
have
to
have that done beforehand would be
too.
awesome.
Yeah.
Did I just come in to do screenings prior to the season starting?
Well, not even screening so much, but like we had a lot of, I don't know about you, Yana, but we had a lot of athletes that were playing in like boots that you were like, that's completely inappropriate for their foot type. Like we had quite a few girls like with really like severe arch issues or whatever, that like were playing in very unsupportive, but like they're playing in really flexible Nikes and things like that, and literally just popped them into like, I think Gus just popped them into an FF, like an ultimate FF, and pretty much everything went away.
Yeah.
So
it's really interesting to me that we let them do complete a lot of preseason in these high heel drop shoes, and then without a thought we let them jump straight into like a almost no drop harder shoe. Like it blows my mind. So I think education is a big standpoint where you could get in more proactively. But in saying that, I think Gus has probably only had the opportunity to be reactive as well. So we're trying to make sure that he's in more like in preseason in particular, so that he can provide a more individualized service to whether we can prevent or reduce how severe some of this stuff gets across the season.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Our men's space, we see a lot of injuries, foot injuries and irritation at that transition from pre-season to in-season, when they're changing from runners to boots. And one of the big ones a lot of like our guys do, they have such low education around feet and foot care that they'll play around with 4 different variations of boots for trainings at different grounds for games. And then all of a sudden they're rolling with 4 different brands of boot, 4 different stud configuration, 4 different stud shape. Like for us, one of our biggest points has just been education about trying to have some consistency in their footwear. Because that chopping and changing is all over the shop. So I think that's a massive role, jumping on the back of Amanda and Yana, about just being proactive in that. Like we could prevent so much foot problems just by educating these guys. And no doubt women's footies going through the same stuff.
It'd be so good to just be able to have a proactive like look at everybody's boots, just go in and be like, okay, you're in a Tigre, or it's a really thin toe cage, you've got really big feet, like you're probably wearing a size too small, go half a size up, that sort of thing. Like just being able to get your eyes over everybody's boots in a club. Like I know that clubs often don't have the funding for that, but like in an ideal world, you'd have a podiatrist just come in and be like, okay, this is a great boot, but we might need to you've got a recurrent ankle history, might need to make the heel cup a bit deeper. Let's do that. Like let's see if we can put you in a deeper heel cup shoe, or like, something like that would be really, really ideal. But like it's so little science behind people's shoe choice. It's usually just like color and whatever kind of thing affiliation they have for brand, essentially.
Yeah. That's really cool. I think, as a podiatrist, maybe there's some form of pre-season screening program where we could look at injury history, look at their boots, and then give them some recommendations. That's something that would probably be really beneficial for sort of all footy clubs. We've got a couple minutes left. If anyone wanted to quickly say something, they're welcome to. Otherwise, we can finish up there and get ready for the afternoon. But appreciate everyone listening. It's a topic that I hold pretty close and I'm very passionate about. So it was awesome to talk to you guys about it. And then, hopefully we can see more footy boots out there on the market in the next few years. But anyone need to say anything else?
Addy, just on the I know you came to work in a footy club. If I was you, given you're so passionate about this space, I would be contacting every VFLW club and offering to come in on day 1 of preseason for free and be like, tell them don't buy boots yet. Day 1 of preseason, you come in. I mean, you wouldn't be able to do it probably over one. That depends how much free time you want to give them, and say quick injury history. What boot? Like bring in your boots from last season. All right, these boots are terrible for you. So before you go and buy whatever is the new trend, this is you get a podiatrist recommendation, and you say, and that's you're really helping, but you're developing some kind of connection with the club.
Yeah, no, that's really cool.
And just
cool idea.
spread it out to every club.
No, sweet. I reckon it's something I'll get cracking on, that's for sure. Thanks, Yana. Cool, sweet. Anyone else, or all good?
Good. Well done, Addy. That was awesome.
No, thanks, Amanda. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Addy.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
you.
Addy.
Good stuff, Addy.